Hankel's fingers were trembling. As my chisel moved toward the wreckage fragment, I thought to myself, this time it's going to break. The previous 3 attempts had ended in failure. The chisel had split in 2 each time. Not the wood. Inside that cold hangar in Hamburg, a man in a white coat stained with graphite and oil was staring at a piece of wreckage. But this wasn't ordinary wreckage. This was an aircraft that the German Air Force hadn't been able to catch for 2 years. One that flew over Berlin skies every day. One fast enough to drive Hermann Göring mad, and it was made entirely of wood. Hankel struck the piece with his fist. He'd expected a metallic sound. What came was that dull, soul-crushing vibration peculiar to wooden coffins. He removed his glasses, wiped them with a cloth, put them back on, and stared at it. "This is plywood," he said. But his voice came out so uncertain that he couldn't even believe his own ears. The young technician beside him dropped his pliers and laughed. The others joined in. "A wooden bomber, huh?" someone said. So the British finally ran out of steel. But by midnight there wasn't a single laugh left in that hangar. In the spring of 1943, something fell in a marsh north of Hamburg. Farmers had heard the sound, but whatever fell didn't burn. Most aircraft caught fire when they crashed, melted away. This one didn't catch fire. When German soldiers reached it, what they found looked almost like a boat, wooden panels so light a man could lift them by himself. There was still the smell of resin in the air, a sweetish smell mixed with smoke. For the Luftwaffe's technical unit, this was the find of the year. The order came immediately: collect everything. Even the smallest fragment was to be sent to the testing center at Recklinghausen, the Luftwaffe's primary test facility. Under floodlights, laid out on wooden supports, the Mosquito was now like a patient on an operating table. Engineers circled around it with clipboards and calipers, their breath fogging in the cold. These were men accustomed to steel and rivets, to welding torches and precision gauges. Not to sandpaper and glue. The first cuts were hesitant, almost surgical. Each layer they peeled back raised more questions than answers. The outer skin was birch veneer, just a few millimeters thick, but surprisingly uniform. Beneath it was a honeycomb of balsa wood, lighter than air but remarkably stiff. Then another layer of birch, all fused together as if grown from a single tree. Dr. Karl-Heinz Hankel directed the analysis. He'd spent years studying the fatigue failures of metal airframes. Now he stood in silence, staring at seamless joints. "They've turned carpentry into engineering," he murmured. His team measured densities, tensile strength, and shear resistance. Every test defied expectations. The laminated composite could bear almost twice the load of aluminum at half the weight. It resisted moisture, heat, and vibration. When one technician tried to separate 2 panels with a hydraulic press, the wood cracked, but the adhesive bond did not. The Germans had used casein glue in their own wooden trainers and gliders. It was a milk-derived adhesive, cheap and easy to make, but it degraded in humidity and heat. This British glue behaved differently. It seemed impervious to everything. Hankel ordered chemical analysis. The laboratory reported a compound unknown in German aviation, a synthetic resin based on phenol and formaldehyde, catalyzed under pressure. When heated, it didn't soften. It hardened further, turning into a thermoset polymer that bound wood fibers at the molecular level. It was in essence synthetic armor hidden inside wood. Hankel couldn't hide his frustration. Germany's chemical industry, once the envy of the world, had produced wonders like synthetic fuel and rubber. Yet it had never developed this kind of adhesive. The reason was painfully simple: resources. Phenolic resins required phenol and methanol derived from coal, and both were being consumed by explosives production. Even if the Luftwaffe had known the formula, they couldn't have made it in quantity. The discovery ignited a mixture of admiration and despair. The Mosquito wasn't just fast, it was practical genius. Every component told a story of adaptation. The British had taken their shortages and turned them into innovation. The fuselage was shaped in 2 mirror halves, molded over concrete forms in furniture factories. When glued together, they formed an airtight shell that required no internal bracing. The result was smoother, lighter and stronger than any riveted construction. One of Hankel's assistants, a young engineer named Vogler, looked at a wing cross-section under magnification. "It looks alive," he said quietly. The glue lines formed patterns like the veins of a leaf. He was right, the structure flexed under stress instead of fracturing. It absorbed shock, dissipated energy, and returned to shape. In a world obsessed with rigidity, the Mosquito had been built to bend. When Hankel presented his findings to Luftwaffe command, the room fell silent. He placed 2 samples on the table, one of aluminum, one of laminated birch bonded with the British resin. The wooden sample bent and snapped back. The aluminum one stayed deformed. "Gentlemen," he said, "we have been building the wrong kind of strength." But pride dies hard. Some officers refused to believe that glue could win a war. Others demanded a German replica, a Holzflugzeug, to prove the concept. Yet deep down, the engineers knew the truth. They could copy the shape, the dimensions, even the engines. But they could not copy the soul of the Mosquito. The glue that made it unstoppable. As they packed their samples for Berlin, the smell of the British resin still hung in the hangar. Sweet, sharp, unyielding. Hankel lingered a moment longer, running a gloved hand over the splintered wing. "They built this in a furniture factory," he whispered. "And we, with all our steel, cannot catch it." In 1938, when the world was preparing for another mechanized war of steel, one man stood before the British Air Ministry with a proposal that seemed almost insulting. Geoffrey de Havilland, tall, composed and quietly stubborn, unfolded blueprints of a bomber that defied every doctrine of modern aviation. It had no defensive guns, no armor plating, and most absurd of all, it was to be made almost entirely of wood. The room of officials listened politely, waiting for the joke. When none came, they rejected the idea outright. Metal was the future, they said. Wood belonged to the past, but de Havilland didn't flinch. He understood something that bureaucrats could not measure in spreadsheets. Speed was armor, and simplicity was survival. At that time, Britain was already stretched thin. Aluminum, the lifeblood of aircraft production, was being consumed faster than it could be refined. Spitfires, Hurricanes and the new Lancasters demanded every sheet of metal the nation could produce. De Havilland looked at the arithmetic, and saw not disaster, but opportunity. His company had spent years perfecting wooden construction for light aircraft and racing planes. Britain's countryside was filled with small workshops, furniture makers, piano builders, cabinet craftsmen, skilled men who could shape wood, but had no place in the metal war. What if, he thought, their hands could be turned toward building something faster, lighter, and quieter than anything on Earth? He envisioned a bomber without turrets or gun crews. Its 2-man cockpit streamlined to a bullet's silhouette. Instead of rivets, layers of birch plywood would be bonded with Ecuadorian balsa wood at the core, materials chosen not for glamour, but for geometry. Birch for strength, balsa for lightness, the two joined by a glue stronger than any mechanical fastener. The technique, known as laminated monocoque construction, had been used in furniture long before aircraft. But in de Havilland's mind, it became an equation of survival. Every ounce saved in armor could be spent on speed. If it could outrun enemy fighters, it wouldn't need to fight them at all. When the war began in 1939, his idea seemed to evaporate under the weight of reality. The Air Ministry ordered bombers with guns, turrets, and thick armor, flying fortresses of metal that could trade blows, but war has a way of humbling certainty. By 1940, after the fall of France and the desperate days of the Blitz, Britain faced shortages so severe that even impossible ideas were reconsidered. De Havilland returned with a prototype design, insisting that his wooden bomber could be built in furniture factories without stealing a single sheet of aluminum from Spitfire production. Reluctantly, they approved one prototype. In the autumn of 1940, under grey Hertford skies, the first Mosquito took shape. Piano builders from London sanded the wings, violin makers crafted the curved nose. The adhesive that bonded every seam came from furniture laboratories, phenol formaldehyde resin, a synthetic glue that hardened into something close to amber. When applied between layers of wood and pressed under heat, it fused into a single material, neither wood nor plastic, but something in between. Light, resilient and remarkably strong, it was quite literally born from craftsmanship and chemistry. On November 25, 1940, the prototype, painted training yellow, rolled onto the runway at Hatfield. Jeffrey de Havilland Jr., the designer's son, climbed into the cockpit. The engines roared, twin Merlin power plants, trembling like restrained animals. As the aircraft landed, the crowd expected struggle. Instead, it leaped forward as if weightless. Within seconds, it was climbing faster than any bomber they had ever seen. At altitude, its speed exceeded 390 miles per hour, faster than the Spitfire Marker Ball, faster than any fighter then in service. The Air Ministry observers, silent moments before, now whispered in disbelief. A wooden plane had outflown the best machines of metal and myth. That night, de Havilland walked alone through his workshop, past the half-finished frames glowing under lamps. He placed his hand on one of the laminated panels and felt the warmth from the curing glue. It was smooth, alive with promise. The world would never see war the same way again. A bomber built from furniture wood had just proven that imagination could outrun fear. When the Mosquito entered combat, it carried no guns, no gunners, and no illusions. Its survival depended entirely on mathematics. The first operational squadrons that received the aircraft in 1941 stared at it with quiet disbelief. Pilots who had flown lumbering Blenheims and Wellingtons were now expected to fly a bomber that looked more like a racing plane, slim, graceful, and unprotected. The crew consisted of only 2 men, a pilot and a navigator seated shoulder to shoulder in a cockpit, barely large enough for both. There was no rear gunner to cover their backs, no armor plate between them and the flak bursts waiting beyond the clouds. The flight manual was brutally simple. If intercepted, do not fight, run. Keep the throttle wide open and trust in the Merlin engines. The Air Ministry, once skeptical, had now become obsessed with the Mosquito's speed. Official tests at Boscombe Down had clocked the aircraft at nearly 400 miles per hour, faster than any operational fighter in the Luftwaffe's inventory. But numbers on a chart and survival in enemy airspace were not the same thing. The Mosquito would have to prove that speed alone could replace armor. Its baptism came on September 20, 1941, when a formation of Mosquitoes from No. 105 Squadron took off from Swanton Morley for their first daylight bombing raid over Oslo. The mission objective was precise: hit the Gestapo headquarters and escape before enemy fighters could react. At 50 feet above the sea, the bombers streaked toward Norway, their wooden wings slicing through spray and mist. Radar stations detected them too late. When the alarm reached Luftwaffe command, the Mosquitoes were already on their return course. German fighters scrambled from Stavanger but never closed the gap. Witnesses on the ground reported a ghostly roar followed by silence, as if the bombers had vanished into thin air. Every aircraft returned to base unscathed. The next test was far bolder. In January 1943, a Mosquito reconnaissance flight penetrated deep into Berlin airspace in broad daylight. The city's sirens wailed for the first time in months, not because of a massive raid, but because of 2 unarmed bombers flying faster than the defending fighters. The Luftwaffe's radar operators watched the blips on their screens accelerate beyond pursuit. When the Mosquitoes dropped their 500-pound bombs on the capital, Hermann Göring himself was in conference. Furious, he shouted that the attack was a personal insult. He ordered interceptors to chase the intruders at all costs. None succeeded. By early 1943, Mosquito crews had begun to understand the machine's rhythm. At 25,000 feet, it danced above flak bursts like a leaf on a storm. The laminated wood absorbed vibrations that would have cracked metal skins. Even direct hits often failed to ignite fires. The absence of aluminum meant fewer sparks and less fuel vapor ignition. Pilots described it as flying a living thing, flexible, forgiving, responsive. One crew returning from a low-level raid over Cologne recounted how tracer fire chased them through the Rhine Valley. The shells seemed to float beside us, then fall away. It was as if the air itself was protecting us. The Mosquito's reputation spread quickly among both sides. British newspapers called it the Wooden Wonder. German pilots called it Der Teufel aus Holz, the Devil of Wood. Its effect on morale was immediate. Luftwaffe squadrons stationed in occupied Europe received new standing orders. If a Mosquito is sighted, do not pursue unless conditions are perfect. The aircraft could not be caught in level flight, and in dives, it accelerated beyond structural safety limits for German planes. Each mission added new legends. In February 1943, Mosquitoes from No. 105 and 139 squadrons executed one of the most daring precision strikes of the war. The daylight raid on Berlin, scheduled to coincide with a speech by Göring himself. As his words echoed through the Reichstag, the windows rattled with the shock of explosions. The timing was so perfect that German propaganda censors couldn't hide the humiliation. The unthinkable had happened. Wooden bombers had struck the heart of the Third Reich and escaped without loss. The success changed everything. The Royal Air Force began redesigning operations around the Mosquito's unique blend of speed and stealth. It became the preferred aircraft for photo reconnaissance, pathfinding, and surgical bombing. Every sortie proved a simple truth. The less you carried, the faster you flew. The faster you flew, the longer you lived. The men who flew it started to believe in its legend. They called it the plane that forgot how to die. But across the channel, inside the cold laboratories and workshops of the Luftwaffe, disbelief turned into obsession. The German High Command wanted to know how a plywood aircraft could humiliate their finest machines. To them, it was not just a military failure, it was a scientific insult. Somewhere inside those smooth wooden panels was a secret the Reich had to uncover. In the spring of 1943, a British Mosquito on a reconnaissance flight over northern Germany was caught in a storm of flak. The pilot managed to glide for miles before crash landing in a marsh near Hamburg. Miraculously, the aircraft didn't burn. When German troops reached the wreckage, they expected twisted metal and melted fragments. Instead, they found something that looked eerily like a broken boat. Smooth wooden panels, light enough for a man to lift, still smelling faintly of resin and smoke. To the Luftwaffe's technical branch, it was the find of the year. The order was immediate: recover everything. Even the smallest fragment was to be sent to a secret analysis hangar outside Recklinghausen, the Luftwaffe's primary testing ground. Under harsh floodlights, the Mosquito lay on wooden trestles like a patient on an operating table. Engineers circled it with clipboards and scalpels, their breath fogging in the cold. They were men accustomed to steel and rivets, to welding torches and precision gauges, not to sanding blocks and glue. The first cuts were hesitant, almost surgical. Each layer they peeled back revealed more questions than answers. The outer skin was birch veneer, only a few millimeters thick, but astonishingly uniform. Beneath it was a honeycomb of balsa wood, light as air, yet remarkably stiff. Then came another layer of birch, all fused together as if grown from a single tree. Dr. Karl-Heinz Henkel led the analysis. He was an expert in materials fatigue, who had spent years studying the failures of metal airframes. Now he stood in silence, staring at the seamless joints. "They've turned carpentry into engineering," he muttered. His team measured densities, tensile strength, and shear resistance. Every test defied expectation. The laminated composite could bear almost twice the load of aluminum at half the weight. It resisted moisture, heat, and vibration. When one technician tried to separate two panels with a hydraulic press, the wood cracked, but the adhesive bond did not. The Germans had used casing glue, a milk-derived adhesive, in their own wooden trainers and gliders. It was cheap and easy to make, but degraded in humidity and heat. This British glue behaved differently. It seemed impervious to everything. Henkel ordered chemical analysis. The laboratory reported a compound unknown in German aviation, a synthetic resin based on phenol and formaldehyde, catalyzed under pressure. When heated, it didn't soften. It hardened further, turning into a thermoset polymer that bound wood fibers on a molecular level. It was, in essence, synthetic armor hidden inside wood. Henkel couldn't hide his frustration. Germany's chemical industry, once the envy of the world, had produced wonders like synthetic fuel and rubber. Yet it had never developed this kind of adhesive. The reason was painfully simple: resources. Phenolic resins required phenol and methanol derived from coal, and both were being consumed by explosives production. Even if the Luftwaffe had known the formula, they couldn't have made it in quantity. The discovery ignited a mixture of admiration and despair. The Mosquito wasn't just fast, it was practical genius. Every component told a story of adaptation. The British had taken their shortages and turned them into innovation. The fuselage was shaped in two mirror halves, molded over concrete forms in furniture factories. When glued together, they formed an airtight shell that required no internal bracing. The result was smoother, lighter and stronger than any riveted construction. One of Hankel's assistants, a young engineer named Vogler, stared at the cross-section of a wing under magnification. "It looks alive," he said quietly. The glue lines formed patterns like the veins of a leaf. He was right, the structure flexed under stress instead of fracturing. It absorbed shock, dissipated energy, and returned to shape. In a world obsessed with rigidity, the Mosquito had been built to bend. When Hankel presented his findings to Luftwaffe command, the room fell silent. He placed 2 samples on the table, one of aluminum, one of laminated birch bonded with the British resin. The wooden sample bent and snapped back. The aluminum one stayed deformed. "Gentlemen," he said, "we have been building the wrong kind of strength, but pride dies hard." Some officers refused to believe that glue could win a war. Others demanded a German replica, a wooden aircraft, to prove the concept. Yet deep down, the engineers knew the truth. They could copy the shape, the dimensions, even the engines. But they could not copy the soul of the Mosquito, the glue that turned fragile wood into a weapon. As they packed their samples for Berlin, the smell of the British resin still hung in the hangar, sweet, sharp, unyielding. Hankel lingered a moment longer, running a gloved hand over the splintered wing. "They built this in a furniture factory," he whispered. "And we, with all our steel, cannot catch it." The order came from the top. If the British could build a wooden bomber that outpaced every German fighter, then Germany would build one faster, stronger and deadlier. The project was given a name meant to mock its rival. Mücker, a tiny insect meant to sting the British Mosquito. On paper, it looked like a statement of pride, an attempt to prove that German engineering could master anything the Allies invented. In practice, it became a slow-motion tragedy of overconfidence. The first prototypes were assigned to a small team at the Luftfahrt Forschungsanstalt in Brunswick. They began with captured Mosquito drawings, and the fragments Hankel's team had meticulously catalogued. But from the beginning, the numbers betrayed them. The British had used lightweight balsa imported from Ecuador, a wood Germany could no longer access due to Allied blockades. Their engineers substituted pine and beech, harder, heavier, more available. A single wing section that weighed 280 kilograms in the Mosquito ballooned to 410 in the Mücker mock-up. The glue too was a compromise. Without access to phenolic resin, the team reverted to case-in adhesive mixed with formalin to slow degradation. It worked well enough in dry weather, but under heat and moisture, it began to soften, a flaw that every engineer recognized but none dared report. Still, the Reich's propaganda machine demanded results. Hankel's reports warning of adhesive instability were quietly rewritten before reaching Berlin. Production orders were issued to furniture factories in Dresden and Kassel. Ironically, the very same kind of workshops the British had used successfully. But German workers faced different conditions: raw material shortages, constant air raids, and shortages of trained labor. The Mosquito had been born in creativity. The Mücker was born in desperation. By late 1943, the first prototype stood complete. A sleek, pale imitation of the British aircraft. Under the floodlights, it looked convincing enough. Twin engines, smooth fuselage, identical dimensions, but the illusion ended as soon as it left the ground. During its maiden flight, the test pilot, Hermann Kessler, noted sluggish controls and unexpected vibration at high speed. At 350 miles per hour, the wings began to resonate. The laminated layers groaned audibly. Within minutes, thin cracks spread along the leading edges. He throttled back and landed hard, the undercarriage collapsing under the strain. When engineers examined the damage, they found the culprit. Moisture had seeped into the glue lines, weakening the joints. The adhesive had not failed outright, but it had softened just enough to alter the aerodynamic shape. In aviation, just enough was fatal. The second prototype fared no better. Built with modified adhesives and extra bracing, it flew heavier and slower. On paper, it reached 360 miles per hour, faster than a Hankel He-111, but still 50 miles per hour slower than the Mosquito it was meant to catch. A third prototype broke apart entirely during a low-altitude dive test. The investigators tried to blame pilot error, but the truth was obvious. The wood had delaminated mid-flight, tearing the wing from the fuselage. By 1944, the Mücker project was effectively dead. What remained were the reports, thick, meticulous documents filled with tables and graphs, but also something rare in German technical writing: despair. One memorandum from a senior engineer admitted that the design cannot achieve parity with British construction due to fundamental material limitations. Another, written in the margins of a test report, read simply, "We are fighting physics with paperwork." Inside the Reich Ministry of Aviation, no one wanted to deliver the news to Hermann Göring. His fury over the Mosquito had already become legend. He had promised Hitler that the Luftwaffe would reclaim the skies. Yet wooden bombers still flew unchallenged over Berlin, taunting them with each daylight raid. When he finally learned that the Mucke had been cancelled, he smashed a glass ashtray against the wall and shouted, "We are defeated by carpenters." For the engineers, the humiliation cut deeper than any reprimand. Germany's identity rested on precision metallurgy and control, qualities the British had somehow turned upside down. The Mosquito was not perfect. It was audacious. It broke rules that German engineering held sacred: never trust organic materials, never rely on manual craftsmanship, never tolerate variability, and yet it worked. Its wooden shell flexed where metal would crack, absorbed vibrations where rivets would fail. Hankel, who had watched the entire fiasco unfold, wrote in his personal journal that autumn, "We are trapped by our own logic. We have machines without imagination, and they have imagination without machines." He never sent that line to his superiors. It would have sounded like treason. But among his peers, the sentiment spread quietly, an acknowledgement that the British had won not through superior industry, but through the courage to defy their own textbooks. As winter settled over the ruins of Germany's cities, the surviving Mosquitoes continued to appear above the clouds, sleek and silent. Their polished wood reflected moonlight like ghosts. Down below, the men who had tried to imitate them stood in their workshops, surrounded by warped wings, cracked fuselages, and the bitter smell of failed glue. The Mucke had proven the one lesson every engineer dreads: copying genius is easy, understanding it is impossible. By 1944, the Mosquito was no longer just an aircraft, it was a presence. It moved through the night skies of Europe like a rumor, impossible to predict, impossible to stop. The Luftwaffe's radar operators dreaded the faint blip that appeared and vanished too quickly to track. Interceptor pilots called it Der Schattenjäger, the shadow hunter. Even ground troops, hearing its low whine at dawn, learned to look up in fear, knowing that if a Mosquito could reach them, no one was safe. The statistics told the story in numbers that defied belief. The average loss rate for heavy bombers like the Lancaster hovered around 5 to 7% per mission. For the Mosquito, it was less than one aircraft lost for every 200 sorties. It meant that a Mosquito crew, unlike their comrades in the slower armored bombers, could survive dozens of missions. Pilots began to joke grimly that flying a Mosquito was safer than walking across Piccadilly after dark. But behind the humor lay something extraordinary. An unarmed aircraft had become the most survivable machine in the Royal Air Force. Inside Germany, the disbelief turned into humiliation. Every intelligence report that crossed Hermann Göring's desk was another wound to his pride. He had once promised Hitler that the Luftwaffe would maintain absolute air superiority. Now British bombers made daily visits to Berlin, and the most infuriating of them all, the Mosquito seemed to choose its timing for maximum insult. In January 1943, it had dropped bombs on Berlin just as Göring began a radio address. In January 1944, it repeated the stunt during another high-profile meeting. Both times it escaped untouched. Göring reportedly shouted, "I turn green with envy when I see those wooden aircraft flying over Berlin. The British can afford to lose pilots, but they don't lose them because they fly so fast that our fighters can't catch them." The truth was more painful. The Luftwaffe had grown old while the Mosquito stayed young. Germany's best pilots were dying faster than they could be replaced, and the new generation lacked the training to fight an enemy that refused to play by the rules. Conventional bombers could be intercepted, predicted, herded into kill zones. The Mosquito ignored every script. It came in singles and pairs, flying at treetop level, then vanished into clouds. By the time radar picked it up, it was already gone. At Recklinghausen and Peenemünde, engineers tried to develop faster interceptors, new variants of the Focke-Wulf 190, the high-altitude Mel 410, even the jet-powered May 262. On paper, the jets could outrun the Mosquito. In practice, they could never be in the right place at the right time. Jet engines of the era needed long runways, perfect fuel, and gentle handling. The Mosquito needed only a patch of grass and 2 Merlins. For German civilians, the Mosquito became a psychological weapon more powerful than any bomb. Its raids were precise: railway stations, Gestapo offices, communication centers, but they carried symbolic weight far beyond their physical damage. In Berlin, people whispered that the British had built a plane invisible to radar. In occupied Copenhagen and Oslo, the resistance celebrated each appearance as proof that the Allies could strike anywhere at any time. The Mosquito's roar became the sound of inevitability. The RAF understood this power and used it ruthlessly. When heavy bombers pounded German cities at night, Mosquitoes flew ahead to drop incendiaries and flares, marking targets with pinpoint accuracy. When the bombers returned home, Mosquitoes returned hours later to strike rescue crews and command posts. They seemed tireless, omnipresent, untouchable. Even when flying alone, a single Mosquito could force the Luftwaffe to scramble entire squadrons of interceptors, burning precious fuel and exhausting pilots for nothing. The German High Command responded with desperation disguised as strategy. New radar networks were built to track fast targets, and propaganda officers claimed that the Mosquito was overrated, that its speed came at the cost of payload. But the numbers could not be hidden. In 1944 alone, Mosquito bombers dropped over 1,900 tons of explosives with fewer than 200 aircraft lost. The figure was so efficient that one British officer quipped, "It's not a bomber, it's a surgical instrument." By autumn, Göring's rage had turned to superstition. He ordered his aides never to mention the aircraft by name during briefings, as if silence could erase it. Fighter command logs show a pattern of exhaustion, pilots claiming to chase phantoms that vanished into cloud. Radar stations reported false echoes moving faster than their calibration limits. Ground crews swore they saw Mosquitoes at altitudes no piston engine could reach. The myth had outgrown the machine. Dr. Hankel, the engineer who had once dissected the captured Mosquito, watched it all unfold from his laboratory. He had stopped correcting his colleagues when they called the plane a ghost. In his private notes he wrote, "It is not the wood that terrifies us. It is the idea that something so light can carry such power." By the final winter of the war, the Mosquito's very name could silence a room in Germany's command centers. Reports of sightings came with a sigh rather than an alarm. Everyone knew that by the time the warning arrived, the damage was already done. The Luftwaffe still flew, but its morale was hollowed out. For them, the Mosquito was not an aircraft, it was inevitability, precision, and humiliation shaped into wings. When the war ended in 1945, the Mosquito had already become legend. It had flown more than 80,000 combat sorties, photography, bombing, pathfinding, and night fighting, with losses so small that even the statisticians doubted their accuracy. In the hangars of post-war Europe, its sleek wooden fuselage seemed an artifact from another world, something too elegant to have belonged to the chaos that created it. Germany lay in ruins, cities scorched by the heavy bombers the Mosquito had guided with uncanny precision. And yet in the minds of the engineers who survived it, was not the Lancaster or the B-17 they remembered with awe. It was the wooden ghost that had humiliated their science. At war's end, Allied inspection teams invited captured German engineers to tour de Havilland's plant at Hatfield. Among them was Dr. Karl-Heinz Hankel, the same man who had once dissected a downed Mosquito and declared its glue a miracle. Now he stood in the assembly hall, watching craftsmen in overalls polish the curved fuselage halves before they were bonded together. The smell of resin filled the air again. Sharp, chemical, unforgettable. He turned to his British escort, a young engineer barely out of university, and asked how many men had designed this process. The Briton smiled. Not many, but thousands built it. That sentence stayed with him for years. In a post-war report, Hankel wrote that the Mosquito's true secret was not chemistry or aerodynamics, but culture, a willingness to let craftsmen and scientists share the same space. Where Germany's factories had been ruled by rigid hierarchy and fear of failure, the British had allowed improvisation. A violin maker could teach an engineer about resonance. A chemist could learn from a furniture worker. Out of that collision of worlds had come something that no pure theory could have predicted. The lessons spread quickly. In the late 1940s, engineers on both sides of the Atlantic began experimenting with new laminated materials, fiberglass, resin composites, and later carbon fiber, all direct descendants of the mosquito's wooden skin. What had been born from scarcity became the foundation of abundance. Even the newly formed American aerospace industry studied de Havilland's methods. Boeing engineers called the Mosquito the ancestor of every composite airframe we build today. In Britain, the aircraft's legend grew quietly. The Royal Air Force kept Mosquitoes in service well into the 1950s, long after jets had taken over the skies. Pilots loved its agility, its silence, and its soul. One veteran said, "It felt like the airplane wanted to live as much as you did." Museums displayed it as a masterpiece of wartime design, but those who had built it remembered something humbler. The smell of sawdust, the rhythm of glue brushes, the sound of piano craftsmen hammering spars together while London shook under the Blitz. For de Havilland himself, the success was vindication. His impossible idea had not only worked but changed the very meaning of engineering. He once told a journalist, "We were never trying to outmuscle the enemy. We were trying to outthink him." His words would echo through every generation of designers who followed. And for the Germans who had tried to imitate the Mosquito, the aircraft became a mirror reflecting their own limits. The Mucke prototypes were melted down after the war, none survived. But in the archives of what became West Germany's new aviation industry, Hankel's notes endured. The final line of his last wartime journal read, "They proved that imagination, when disciplined by necessity, is stronger than steel." Time transformed the Mosquito from a weapon into a lesson. It taught that progress sometimes comes not from abundance but from desperation, not from metal and muscle but from daring to see beauty in the ordinary. Out of plywood and glue had risen a machine that terrified an empire and redefined what was possible. Today, historians still debate whether the Mosquito was the greatest aircraft of the Second World War. But the numbers speak for themselves. Faster than any fighter of its era, lighter than any bomber, and deadlier to the enemy's pride than to its troops. When you walk past one in a museum, its surface still gleams like varnished oak. You can almost smell the resin, the ghost of that glue that once defied an empire. The men who built it are gone now, their names scattered across archives and airfields, yet their idea remains alive. Every time a modern airliner takes off with composite wings or a spacecraft launches wrapped in resin and fiber, they proved that technology is not born from comfort but from courage. The courage to build what everyone else calls impossible. So the next time you see a Mosquito's photograph, slender, smooth and silent, remember what it represented. Not just British ingenuity, not just wartime necessity, but the moment when imagination outran fear. If you believe that true strength lies in daring to dream beyond logic, leave a comment below. And if you think the world still underestimates the power of human creativity, hit that like button and subscribe for more untold stories that remind us why even wood and glue can change history.